Hello and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming, and in this video we are going to be looking over briefly all of the factions in Star Wars Legion to help give you an idea of which one you might want to play. So we are going to be looking at the pros and cons for all four of these factions, and not just for how they play on the tabletop, but also what it's like to collect and have to paint them. Because as we all know, that is part of the hobby also, and is often overlooked when people are getting into a new faction. You don't want to buy into an army that you absolutely loathe painting and assembling. And as most of us know, Star Wars Legion launched with the original trilogy factions of the Imperials and the Rebels. And then down the road we were introduced to the prequel factions of the Grand Army of the Republic, alongside the Separatist Alliance, also known as the Trade Federation. And we will be covering all four of these factions in this video. And first up we are going to have the OG baddies, the Empire themselves. And we are going to start with the pros of this army, starting off with the rules and meta, and then going into what it means to paint and collect them, followed by the cons that will follow the same topics in respective order. And the first major pro point that the Imperials have is that they are a very durable army. The humble Stormtrooper is sporting a red defensive die with that armor, and with the exception of Scout Troopers and a few heroes, you're going to pretty much have red defensive die throughout your army. That means you're not going to be as worried about making those defensive rolls, or being punished for being caught out in the open without dodge tokens. After that, another major pro is that the Empire is going to have a diverse array of heroes. As we know, heroes are our beloved characters from the movies translated into the game format, and the Empire has a wide selection to go off of here, ranging from expensive Force users to affordable support-based officers who can buff your infantry, or offensive range-oriented bounty hunters. Really, I think the only hero type that the Imperials are lacking is a fast Jedi character, which they may never get, but aside from that, the Imperials have almost every kind of hero that an army could want, and you can collect and field them to match your playstyle. After that, we're going to have a very strong unit synergy throughout the Imperial faction. They really are a faction that has a honed-in identity as that sort of board-control gunline suppressive faction, and that's mainly due to keywords and the ability to coordinate with your officers and troops. There's also a host of complementary upgrades and special forces units that collaborate very well with your basic core and officer models. After that, we're going to see that the Imperial faction has a pretty strong host of infantry units to choose from. At first glance, they do seem like a faction that is the yin to the Rebels' yang, where they have weak offensive capabilities but strong defensive capabilities. That is most notable with the Stormtroopers and Snowtroopers' white offensive die with a surge to hit. However, that is about as flimsy as Imperial offensive abilities get, and there's a litany of synergies, buffs, and upgrades that make strong use of that surge to hit and dramatically increase the offensive capabilities even of the humble Stormtrooper. On top of that, we do have Shore Trooper and Death Trooper models that we can take who have proven themselves in competitions and cemented Rogue One thematic lists as a very competitive option. But after that, we are going to have one of our major pros for the Imperials when it comes to the hobby aspect of collecting this army, and that is the fact that they are going to be a lower model count army, which means you have to paint less models to have a functional collection that you can play on the tabletop. Now, like many of the other bonuses that we're going to see in this video, this is a bit of a double-edged sword, and we will come back and look at what this lower model count means when we look at some of the cons for the Imperial faction. But after that, another major pro that we're going to have for the Empire is that you get to shit-talk your enemy in a snide British accent. Half of playing Star Wars Legion, as we all know, is just quoting memes, and the more quotes and memes you have relatable to your faction, the more tolerable getting raffle-stomped is going to be. But that will move us along to our cons for playing the Imperial faction. First of all, this army is going to feel very sluggish. You are a lumbering system of bureaucracy enforcing its will on the galaxy, and your army will feel like that on the tabletop. You are not going to be performing hit-and-run attacks, and most of your board control is going to come through suppressive fire and ranged attacks. Also, if you are getting into Star Wars Legion because you really want to play Jedi, and you are a very melee-oriented wargamer, you will find that the Empire has the slowest Force users in the game. After that, we're going to see that the Empire is one of the higher point cost factions. And this again is part of that double-edged sword with having something like strong infantry, durable units, and that lower model count to paint. It's all going to cost you in points when you're building your lists. And while having the most activations in Star Wars Legion isn't everything, it can be quite punishing, especially when you're trying to complete objectives. After that, we are going to look at some of the hobby aspects of the Empire, and my main issue with the Empire is that you're going to get some of the lower quality sculpts that Star Wars Legion has to offer. The Empire was one of the first factions released for this game, and I would probably put money on Stormtroopers being one of the first units they designed. Now, FFG has dramatically increased in quality of their sculpts with every release they've had. So when you go all the way back to the beginning, there is a lot left to be desired, especially with the Stormtroopers, because the Rebel troopers themselves seem to be just humanoids wearing cloaks and regular military garb. The lower quality of their sculpts isn't quite as noticeable as the bright white armor of the Stormtroopers and some of the awkward posing that they have. After that, it's worth noting that while you are going to have a lower amount of models that you need to paint, Imperial models can be deceptively difficult to get right when it comes to painting. You'd think that the all-white armor of the Stormtroopers or the all-black armor of the Death Troopers would be incredibly easy to nail down, but if you really want satisfactory results on those models that goes beyond just crude highlights, you really are going to need to hone in your skills, especially when it comes to painting white and objective source lighting. Contrast paint works fine when your model is a variety of different colors and patterns, but from my experience on these monochromatic models, you really do need to add some variety here, or else the flaws of these simpler techniques are really going to jump out at you. But lastly, another major con for the Empire is that you are going to really rely on list gimmicks. And that might sound unfair, because really all of Legion is about building lists with different heroes and units that synergize to create an overall gimmick. But what makes this problematic with the Imperial faction is the fact that these gimmicks aren't just achieved by swapping out a few heroes here and there or upgrade cards, but rather tailoring your entire list around it, which requires you to swap out more units overall if you want to do something different with your army. For example, the linchpin of an Imperial suppression list isn't Darth Vader or the Emperor, but rather several units of Shore Troopers, perhaps supported by Death Troopers also. But that is going to wrap up the pros and cons for the Imperial faction, and move us along to take a look at the Rebels. Now, the Rebels were the other faction released alongside the Emperor with the initial core set release, and for a long period of time, I think people would agree that it was the lesser of the two factions. However, with points balances and new unit releases since, the Rebels have really stepped into their own and become a respectable faction, though I would argue that they are probably still the least played faction in the game. But let's go ahead and start off looking at their pros, and first of all here, you're going to have a bunch of ranged heroes. Your heroes and options for the Rebels are going to be a palette of soldiers, renegades, and scum. And that's going to be to the point where even your hero Jedi Luke Skywalker himself is going to be sporting a blaster. So if you like the idea of multiple heroes with powerful offensive ranged keywords, the Rebels may suit your style. After that, the Rebels are going to have inexpensive units, and that goes for their heroes also, which means you're going to be able to take a lot of those ranged heroes we just mentioned to not only bolster your list and unit support, but also allow you to build a pretty creative and robust deck of command cards. But their infantry and support units are also pretty inexpensive in their own right, and it will be easier for Rebel players to build lists with higher activation counts, and overwhelm their enemies with models, which is, again, very advantageous in a game that relies on objective capture. After that, another major perk that we're going to see for the Rebels is a very strong melee orientation throughout the army. And while most other factions in Star Wars Legion rely on their lightsaber-wielding heroes to get the melee work done, the Rebels have melee-oriented upgrades and units sprinkled throughout their faction. From Wookiee warriors to the notorious Tauntauns, you can easily build an up-close and dirty list with the Rebels. Another pro that complements that melee orientation is going to be the fact that the Rebels are a very fast faction. In stark contrast to the Empire, they are going to have a lot of high mobility units and the ability to infiltrate with a number of their characters. This aspect of the Rebels, when paired with their high activation counts, can create a very potent objective capping and board control oriented list. But lastly, when it comes to collecting the Rebel faction, there is one major bonus you have here, and that is going to be the aliens you get. There's some great sculpts of iconic alien species, and having them sprinkled throughout your force is really going to break up the monotony of painting these guys, and give your squads a lot of flavor and identity. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the cons for the Rebel faction, as I think they are pretty prevalent. And first and foremost, the Rebels are going to consist of relatively fragile units. In stark contrast with the Empire, the Rebels are going to have a weaker overall armor save, often white dice, followed up by more innate offensive capabilities. The problem with this is that you can always buff up your offensive capabilities with heavy weapon upgrades, but the same cannot be done for your defensive dice. And even most of your heroes are going to be rolling those miserable white defense die that very often come up blank-faced. This is going to make the rebels very reliant on dodge tokens and cover, and will allow your opponent to punish you severely if you do not operate properly. And this may be one of, if not the biggest drawback to the rebel faction, as it prevents you from operating as a reactionary force, and really relies on you being proactive and planning ahead thoroughly. But after that, we're going to see that the rebels are just a one Jedi faction. Luke Skywalker is the last Jedi, and despite being a very melee-friendly army, he is going to be your only saber wielder you have. Now, in the future, that may change. We may see characters from Rebels show up, or Old Ben, but even then, I don't see this faction ever having more than 3 or 4 Jedi. To me, that's not that big of a deal personally, but I know that will be a concern for some people who really want to see those lightsabers represented on the tabletop. After that, we are going to notice that the Rebels do unfortunately have some pretty dull command cards, and this again is a drawback that sort of comes from that stigma of being the first faction released for the game. If you look at a lot of the early command cards, even for heroes that we love like Han Solo or Princess Leia, you're going to see that they're pretty rudimentary and don't do a whole lot of flashy stuff. And even in the newer command cards on characters like Cassian, you get these paragraphs of text that set up some pretty bizarre gimmicks that only benefit you in niche scenarios that you must set up very meticulously. So while you do have a lot of cheap operatives and commanders that you can throw in your lists, you almost sort of need that to get an impressive array of command cards. After that, we're going to see that the Rebels do have some pretty weak supporting units. Yes, there are powerful and useful units, but much like the Rebel infantry, they are lacking in durability, and that's something that you really want from those support units. And lastly, we're going to have a major con that's related to collecting and painting the Rebels, one that I think is a pretty big factor of why people aren't interested in this faction, and that's that the Rebels are boring to paint and look at. For the most part, with their Endor fatigues, they are basically just regular looking soldiers, and if you're coming into Star Wars Legion from another hobby, you're probably pretty tired of painting all of drab and khaki already. It's definitely not the first aesthetic that you think of when you think Star Wars. And while there are cool ways to get around this, like painting Sullust-themed Rebels or something like that, I do find them to be the least aesthetically pleasing. Fortunately, I think the people over at FFG noticed this drawback also, and introduced a bunch of those alien sculpts in their expansion packs. And while that is a major bonus, it doesn't save the overall faction when it comes to aesthetics for me. But that is going to wrap up the Rebels and the original trilogy factions, and move us along to the first of the prequel factions, which of course is the Grand Army of the Republic, also known as the Clones. And first up here, right away, you're going to see that the Clones are an incredibly powerful faction full of powerful units. Down to the basic Clone Trooper squad, they are going to be sporting red defensive dice and black offensive dice. That's going to be the best of both worlds from the Rebels and the Imperials. And this stays pretty consistent throughout the faction. When offensive white dice do show up for the clone faction, it's usually in high volume. And when they show up defensively, it's usually hidden behind armor. So throughout the faction, you're going to have a pretty consistent durability and offensive capability across the board. After that, another major pro that might make you want to consider playing this faction is the fact that the Republic is very much the faction of the Jedi. Sith may always come in the rule of twos, but that certainly isn't the case for their light side counterparts, as we already have Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Yoda on the horizon. I can all but guarantee that we will be seeing a Mace Windu sometime down the road, and there's many more Jedi to choose from, including the possibility of generic Jedi potentially showing up as a Special Forces unit. But if you're a player who's not really interested in Jedi or melee as an overall faction strategy, I have good news for you. The Republic is also the faction of clone heroes. Now, we all love our clones, and what makes clone heroes so good in this faction is the fact that they are going to have an innate synergy with the rest of your army. So even if you have a totally combat-oriented clone commander, they are inextricably going to be able to benefit your clone troopers around them. And this is immediately demonstratable when you look at Clone Commander Rex and how well he's been performing on the tabletop and in tournaments. And this will bring us to our next major pro of the Republic faction, one that ties in directly with the clones, and that is going to be their token sharing ability. Clone troopers are allowed to share tokens with one another if they are within range 1 and line of sight. And this is a massive bonus that's going to allow your troopers to further synergize and support with one another. And this all is going to allow for a very forgiving playstyle that's going to allow you to get your green tokens onto units that need them in situations where other factions would not be able to. And that again is going to string us along to our next major pro for the clone army, and that is very versatile strategies. Having strong defensive and offensive capabilities, and being able to reallocate those green tokens, is going to allow you to play as a very reactionary force that can serve as a foundation for any other strategies you might be going for, such as Secret Mission on R2-D2 or Padme, or by simply forming a blow-them-out-of-the-water gun line. We even may see Suppression seep into this faction as a potential list-building meta. But now we're going to move along and take a look at some of the pros of painting and collecting the Republic Army. And first of all, much like the Empire, we are going to have a low model count faction, probably more so than any other faction in the game. And to give you a good example of this, in my most recent match with my clone faction, I fielded an 800 point list with just 17 models, of which only 12 were clone troopers. And lastly, for the pros, we are going to have the fact that the Republic is going to have different Legion markings for your clone troopers that you can apply should you wish. So if you don't want that monotonous white armor, you can break it up with some blue markings for the 501st Legion or some gold markings for the 212th, and really customize your vehicles and troopers to be your own faction. And yes, I have seen people do this with Stormtroopers too, but I think it's much more prevalent and thematic for the Republic faction. And having that option to just add a little bit of color to those monochromatic models truly does go a very long way. But that is going to move us along to some of the drawbacks you might experience from collecting and playing the Republic faction. And first of all, going hand in hand with all the bonuses you saw there, we're going to have the highest point cost army. The Republic very much is the elite faction in Star Wars Legion, one that gives you the best of both worlds with good offensive and defensive capabilities. But this all comes at a price, and your lists are going to be very tight when it comes to points expenditure, and you will often find yourself coming up at about 8 activations, which is easily out-activated by most other factions in the game. It also means that you're often not going to be able to play all of the models that you want. A good example of this was all the list building ideas that people came up with when Anakin Skywalker dropped and everyone was trying to run Anakin and Obi-Wan lists. Those two Jedi alone are likely going to take up half of your 800 points, and leave you with a razor-thin expenditure margin for your clone troopers and other upgrades. And once again, this is going to string us directly along to our next major con of the Republic faction, and that is the fact that they can be a very easy faction to punish on the tabletop. Red armor saves are good, but they are still only a 4+ save, meaning it's a 50-50 chance that you will be losing those very expensive clone troopers each time you roll one of those dice. The same goes for Obi-Wan, whose entire gimmick is to soak wounds, which he often falls victim to himself. Less models on the field also means less objective seizing capabilities, and while clones don't always have a whole lot of trouble tabling their opponents, a spry enemy commander can easily steal the game right from under their nose, simply by playing the objective and playing it fast and hard. And those two tabletop drawbacks are really some of the major ones that the clone army faces and hinders them on the battlefield, and honestly apply to most elite factions in most wargames. But after that, there are a few additional drawbacks in regard to collecting and painting the Republic faction, and the first of those, much like the Empire, is going to be that deceptive ease of painting. Once again, it's not just lathering a bunch of Apothecary White onto your primed white models. If you want good results, you're really going to have to hone in a strategy and understand how to make things like shading and highlighting work for you. And while those Legion markings we mentioned in the pros helps break up some of the monotony of this chore, it does not relieve it entirely. Lastly, we are going to have to face the truth as a Republic player myself that this is the meta faction. These are the Space Marines of Star Wars Legion. And people may come to resent you for that. Now, I don't think Star Wars has or ever will have balancing problems on the scale of Warhammer, but it's no question that clones are one of the most powerful and rewarding factions to play in the game, and while I wouldn't call them OP, I would definitely call them very forgiving. Also, being the quote-unquote meta faction also means that your products are going to be in high demand. Not only are the clones awesome and everyone seems to want to collect and play them just because they love the clones, they are also the competitive faction, and competitive players are going to want to buy them, and we have seen that in the clone releases. Almost everything clone sells out immediately, and it takes quite some time, honestly way too long, for them to restock. And while these are not going to stop me from playing and collecting my beloved clones, they are hurdles that we must consider. But that will move us along to our fourth and final faction, which of course is going to be the Separatist Alliance, also known as the Trade Federation or CIS. And first up on the list of pros for the droid army, we are going to have powerful heroes. These guys have some seriously potent characters. Right out of the gate, we got General Grievous with his 8 wounds, followed up by Count Dooku, who is arguably the best Force user hero in the game. Yes, they did have Cad Bane, that was a bit of a swing and a miss, but that was followed up by Darth Maul, who's probably the most hard-hitting operative in the game. And with these powerhouse commanders often come great command cards. But after these powerful heroes, we are also going to have a faction that is very low in point cost. In fact, the Trade Federation is more or less the lowest point cost faction in the game. And that's mainly because the humble B1 Battle Droid squad is incredibly inexpensive and can really pad out your activations and core slots, allowing you to invest more points into other options such as those expensive, powerful heroes that we just mentioned. And having these numerous, low point cost units really allows you to build very flexible and diverse lists. But after that, one of the major perks of the Trade Federation that gives them their identity is going to be that army-wide coordination ability that they have. This trait is of course emblematic of that droid army synaptic command and control, and allows you to blanket your army with face-up order tokens and give you a lot more control over which tokens you're pulling and activating what unit you want when you need them to. After that, we are going to have the faction trait in which droids do not gain suppression. Yes, they still gain panic tokens, and yes, they can panic and run off the field, but that is far more difficult to do than just suppressing them so they lose an action, something that droids just don't have to worry about. And that's great, because losing actions on your units really does hurt, and not having that come into play with your force is really going to diminish the effectiveness of enemy suppression lists that you may come up against. After that, we are going to have a pro for the Trade Federation that bleeds over from meta into collection also, and that's going to be the diverse units that they have. This is a faction full of many different droids of many different color palettes, working alongside cyborgs, alien bounty hunters, and dark Jedi. There's a whole lot of variety in this faction, and that doesn't just apply to painting them. The rules are very, very different from unit to unit for the Trade Federation. For example, compare the leap from Phase 1 to Phase 2 clone troopers alongside the leap from B1 battle droids to B2 super battle droids. The clones are just a slight tweak in keywords and stats, while the B2 battle droids are an entirely unique unit. And the unit variety only gets more exponential when you branch outside of the Trade Federation's core options. And lastly, a major pro for the Trade Federation is that when you're collecting these guys, you are going to be having an incredibly easy faction to paint. So while they are very numerous, you will likely be spending more time painting bases than you will the actual models themselves. The B1 battle droids are more or less the definition of monochromatic, and I paint mine by simply spraying them with Army Painter's Skeleton Bone, and then washing them with Agrax Earthshade. Paint the guns with Black Templar, and you are more or less finished. That's how easy it is. And that gives you plenty of time to focus on painting your heroes and other units to higher quality. But much like the Rebels, I think the Trade Federation does have some serious drawbacks. And first up on the list of cons for this faction, we are going to have the fact that they have the weakest units in the game. B1 battle droids are absolute cardboard and cannot attack or defend competently, which is very thematic when you consider how they perform in the movies. So while you are going to have a lot of them on the battlefields, even the most humble of enemy core units are likely going to tear through them. And if you're not used to the rules of Star Wars Legion or how Horde armies operate, this may be incredibly demoralizing. You really need to go into your battles with a well-written list and a premeditated strategy that is going to complement it. They do not make for a very reactionary force, and you should know what units need to be where when the fighting starts to go down. Otherwise, your opponents will simply punch through you like a wet paper bag. And next up on the list of cons, we are going to have the fact that the Trade Federation and Separatist Alliance heroes are very selfish heroes. They often do not care about your B1 battle droids, and operate supporting themselves and themselves alone, sometimes even at the behest of your battle droid's health. And while this does make them very powerful, it can also mean that you're going to be leaving your entire droid army without face-up order tokens and coordination, while your heroes run out ahead, charging into battle with their 1-pip card activated. So don't expect your powerful heroes to boost and synergize with the rest of your force, but more often siphon away from it, which can range from irrelevant to highly problematic, all depending on how well you strategized. And after that, we are going to have the flip side of the coin for that no suppression army-wide ability, and that is going to be the AI default actions. Which means if your droids are not given face-up order tokens, they are going to resort to a sort of instinctive programming where they must perform an action as their first, usually being attack. And again, while this is a feat that has easy workarounds and isn't the end of the world, even if it does happen, it's something that you need to strategize around, and if you do not do so, you will be punished greatly. After that, we are going to have a con that is a major, albeit contemporary problem with the Trade Federation, and that is going to be an overall lack of core strategies for this faction. You have access to some very powerful heroes here, you have access to a lot of droids and a lot of variety of droids. However, none of them really directly synergize with each other. And while we are starting to see the suppressive keyword show up more and more in the game, right now, it feels like the only core theme of the Trade Federation is to have Chaff B1 battle droids act as guardians for your big heroes. And that creates a sort of army-wide cohesion where it feels like your commanders and your operatives are sort of acting independently from the bulk of your droid army. Meanwhile, when you're building your list, you will spend most of that time focusing on maintaining that army-wide coordinatability. And while that certainly is a major trait of this faction, simply having face-up order tokens isn't really a strategy on its own. If you look at things like Imperial gunline suppression lists, or rebels focusing on getting dodges out to keep their troops alive, all of those strategies and how they play into list building go way beyond just the order step. And the final con for the Trade Federation, which is one prevalent throughout Horde armies and all wargames, is going to be the high model count. And yes, I did mention that these guys are very easy to paint for the most part, and Legion still is a relatively low model count game, so an army of B1 battle droids isn't nearly as bad as painting an army as, say, 300 Tyranids for Warhammer 40k. Still, those models do need to be based, and if you're buying premium bases, that can get very expensive. On top of that, it does play into transporting and storing them. They are going to take up more space overall. And with the amount of people out there who are storing their models with magnets on magnetic storage, it means more magnets that you have to buy, which are not cheap in their own right. So while almost every other major wargame out there has far worse conditions when it comes to painting and collecting Horde armies, the Trade Federation still feels the bite of some of those aspects. But that will wrap up all of the pros and cons for the Trade Federation, thus wrapping up all the pros and cons for the 4 main factions in Star Wars Legion. And before this video ends, we're going to take a look at a quick synopsis of all 4 of these factions that gives you a very minimalist rundown of how they play, the one keyword I would use to describe that faction, and then also an arbitrary level of difficulty that I have assigned to them. So first up, we are going to have the Empire here, and the one word I would use to describe them is going to be gunline. They are a faction consisting of strong infantry units that focus on battlefield control through suppression and long-range attacks. For collecting purposes, they are tedious but low volume to paint, which makes them tolerable, but will require you to hone your skills to specific styles and techniques. And lastly, the difficulty that I would assign to them based on their list building and tabletop performance is going to be moderate. They are a relatively forgiving faction, their synergies are pretty broad and easy to put together, and I don't think most entry-level players will have a whole lot of trouble diving into this faction. After that, we are going to have the Rebels, and the word that I would use to describe this faction is the Finesse faction. They are a hero-heavy army that really relies on strategic maneuvers, and for painting purposes, they are a relatively generic army to collect. You are going to be using those olive drabs and khakis, and more or less just painting more little soldiers. That being said, it is still Star Wars, you get some aliens to mix up the variety, and you are painting a faction of moderate volume, which is tolerable. And for faction difficulty, to make these guys work on the tabletop, I am giving the Rebels a rating of hard. You really do need to plan ahead with these guys, otherwise your enemies are going to punish you and remove you from the tabletop very quickly. And thirdly, we are going to have the Republic faction, and the word I would use to describe them is of course going to be elite. They are the elite faction of Star Wars Legion, boasting the best baseline armor save and offensive capabilities. Their army consists of powerful models with very, very strong synergies. And for painting purposes, they are going to have some monotonous painting along the lines of the Imperials, but with some very welcomed room for creativity. And for difficulty to use on the tabletop, they are going to be getting a rating of easy. Their token sharing capabilities make them very forgiving and easy to synergize across the board, and the fact that their recent releases have been very, very strong units is also a strong indicator that they are now the meta faction of Star Wars Legion. And lastly, again, we are going to have the Trade Federation or Separatist Alliance, and the word I would describe this faction is of course going to be Horde. They are the vast, brainless mob of fragile units being coordinated by those few powerful heroes. For painting purposes, they are going to be a very high-volume army, but that is counterbalanced by the fact that most of their units are very easy to paint. However, you will need to take things like basing and supplies into consideration. And for difficulty on the tabletop, I am going to be giving the Trade Federation a difficulty rating of hard. Droids are incredibly flimsy, and you need to know how to leverage them en masse against your opponent, otherwise he's just going to rip apart your army one by one, and those powerful heroes of yours are going to be looking down the barrel of multiple enemy units at turn 4 and 5, and it will all be too little too late. This of course also isn't helped by the fact that every release for the Trade Federation has been very lackluster in comparison with the Republic counterparts. And that wraps up my brief summary of the 4 factions for Star Wars Legion, and what you may like or dislike about them. I really hope this video has helped steer some new players in the right direction, or perhaps even veteran players who are looking to start a new faction. If you're just getting into Star Wars Legion, check out my channel and some of the other videos I've uploaded on here. I cover a lot of units the game has to offer, mostly focusing on the prequel factions, and help players and myself understand how they can fit into a list and what to equip them with. There's also plenty of other buyer's guides on YouTube that can help you get started in the hobby. Also, if you appreciate this content, consider subscribing to my channel, turning on notifications so you can see my new videos, and hitting the like button on this one. If you have any other questions or advice, please leave a comment below. I try and reply to as many as I can, as long as they are thoughtful and have reasoning behind them. And if you're a veteran player watching this video, consider jumping in the comments also and helping out the new players coming into this hobby. As always guys, thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.